I'm a professor at Boston College, and I chair the seminar on Russian and Eurasian Jewry here at the Davis Center at Harvard University. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, or whatever time of day it may be for you. And I'm very happy to welcome our speaker, Dr. Julia Riegel, whom I will introduce in a little while. But before I do that, let me just say how grateful I am to the staff of the Davis Center, in particular Laura Sargent, for all the work they do to make these events successful. And also, this seminar is co-sponsored by Harvard's Center for Jewish Studies, and we're very grateful to them as well. And lastly, I just want to highlight some of the events we had this year and one more event that we are anticipating. We have tried in curating our programs this year to pay special tribute to the ongoing war in Ukraine. And so we had back in October, Yakov Falkov, Israeli historian who spoke on the Shoah through the eyes of Soviet intelligence. And of course, Ukraine, as you can imagine, plays a crucial role in the story of the occupied Soviet territories. And then back in November, we had Victoria Hitterer, who spoke about the memorialization of Babin Yar. And only 2 weeks ago, we had Yohanan Petrovsky-Stern, who spoke about ethno-religious minorities in wartime Ukraine, which almost brings us to today's speaker. But I just want to highlight that on April 19th, we will have our last event of the season, Professor Marat Greenberg of Reed College, and he will be speaking about Jewish Russian and Jewish Ukrainian science fiction. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Julia Riegel. Julia Riegel received their PhD in modern European history at Indiana University Bloomington in 2021. They are currently a Harry Starr Fellow in Judaica at Harvard University. Their research interests include modern Polish Jewish cultural history, the Holocaust, and music during war and genocide. As a Starr Fellow, Dr. Riegel is working on their first monograph, originally titled In the Season of Hunger and Plague, Musical Life in the Warsaw Ghetto. This project uses sources written and preserved by ghetto residents to reconstruct how music performance represented, reproduced, and contributed to the ghetto's complex social and cultural dynamics. Dr. Riegel is also currently writing an article, or perhaps has already finished writing the article, we may find out that, on portrayals of Ludwig van Beethoven in Yiddish literature, and developing a second book project, which sounds absolutely fascinating, on gender, sexuality, and perceived collaboration in camps and ghettos during the Shoah. Dr. Riegel's publications also include a very important article on the musician, ethnographer, and journalist Menachem Kipnis, and also articles for volumes 3 and 4 of the Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos. I am very happy to welcome Julia Riegel. The title of their talk is Music in the Warsaw Ghetto, 1940 to 1942, Jewish Identity, Culture, and Community in Crisis. Julia, please take it away.
Sorry, unmuting there. Thank you so much, Dr. Schreier, and thank you also to the Davis Center for welcoming me here today. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity and to share a bit of my research with all of you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Give me one moment here. All right, this is hopefully working. All right, so as Dr. Schreier mentioned, my talk today is on music in the Warsaw Ghetto, 1940 to 1942, Jewish Identity, Culture, and Community in Crisis. This perhaps doesn't quite fit in with the larger theme of the year of these talks on the war in Ukraine, but there may perhaps be some parallels, particularly when it comes to care for children during wartime, that we might bring up during the discussion later. So to jump right into it. The soul of the child and youngster grows more and more tainted. The lack of schools, the gutter, absolute demoralization leave their terrible mark. What sort of generation will grow out of all of this? When Warsaw Ghetto diarist Wasser wrote these words in December of 1940, the ghetto's walls, sealed the previous month, enclosed Europe's largest Jewish community in profound poverty and misery. Though the ghetto was highly socioeconomically stratified, none were entirely spared its privations and its terrors. And fears that both children and adults would be morally damaged by their conditions ran rampant. And yet, Wasser's question encapsulated those fears at a moment when ghetto residents still envisioned a future for Polish Jews, as his question, what sort of generation will grow out of all of this, implied. All who strove to improve the conditions of daily life in the ghetto faced a terrible dilemma. There were simply never enough resources to meet the tremendous need. Still, for most of the ghetto's existence, the majority of its residents did envision a future for their community, and many decided to do whatever they could to help prolong and improve their suffering neighbors' lives, as well as their own lives. Moreover, many residents saw the ghetto's dehumanizing environment as just as much an existential threat to its residents as material deprivation and violence, and they actively worked to combat that dehumanization. In this struggle, music became a vital tool. So my presentation today is based on the book project, as Professor Schreier mentioned in the introduction, In the Season of Hunger and Plague, Musical Life in the Warsaw Ghetto. In the book, I'm analyzing how Jews in the ghetto used music to define and assert some degree of control over the spaces they inhabited, as well as to seek to define the nature of their community. Today, I'm going to first give some brief historical background on the Warsaw Ghetto itself, and then discuss my sources and briefly outline the stakes of the project as a whole. Then I'm going to outline some of the many roles that music occupied in the ghetto, illustrating the diversity of musical expression within its walls. For the bulk of the talk today, I'm actually going to focus specifically on the roles music played in children's lives as a case study. In particular, I'll focus on how music became a tool of shaping a hoped-for Jewish future embodied in Jewish children, and how those children exercised their own agency in this process. To give you a brief overview on the ghetto, it was the largest ghetto in Eastern Europe, the largest ghetto in Europe, in fact, established in the late autumn of 1940, relatively late compared to other ghettos in occupied Poland before the invasion of the Soviet Union. It, as I mentioned, was the largest of its kind, with a peak population of around 450,000 people. It enclosed about 30% of Warsaw's population in just 2.5% of its area. You can see the area marked in yellow on the map on the slide here. This is about 1.3 square miles. It is not a large area, even though it was the largest ghetto. This population was pretty remarkably diverse in a number of ways. The Jews who were imprisoned in the ghetto were not just from Warsaw. Many had either fled or were deported from other towns and cities in Poland, other areas of Eastern Europe, and in some cases, Germany and other areas as well. And the ghetto existed for a little less than 2 years in the form that I study in my project. I really look at the period between when the ghetto was established and late July of 1942, when deportations from the ghetto to the Treblinka death camp began. The ghetto still existed in a certain form after those deportations. That series of mass deportations known as the Great Deportation ended in September of 1942, but it had essentially been transformed into a forced labor camp after that point, and there was very little space for cultural life or musical life after that time. There were a couple of exceptions, which I could talk about in the Q&A if anyone's curious, but for the most part, I'm focusing on this period between roughly October, November 1940 and July 1942. So Coming now to the sources for this project. While hardly any sheet music and no audio recordings survived the war, there is a rich body of texts preserved on the lived experience of hearing music in the ghetto. Very fortunate in that regard. Under the direction of the historian Emanuel Ringelblum, he was a Polish Jewish historian imprisoned in the ghetto, the organization Oyneg Shabbos, meaning Sabbath Joy, became the ghetto's underground archive, collecting tens of thousands of pages of documentation on ghetto life, including a wide range of materials on music, which I employ in my project. These materials were buried in order to preserve them after the deportations began. They were buried in the tin boxes and milk canisters shown in one of the images on this PowerPoint slide. I also use Gazeta Żydowska, or the Jewish Gazette. This was the only legally published Jewish newspaper in occupied Poland, which makes it a bit of a complex source to use, as it was, of course, produced under censorship. While its reporting on world events is not particularly reliable, it does have a rich body of articles on sort of daily life and events in especially the larger ghettos of Poland. And it's particularly valuable for that, in addition to advertisements for events, and particularly relevant to my work, concert reviews, and editorials on the importance of cultural life. There were actually, at different points in time, at least 5 different people working as concert reviewers for Gazeta Żydowska, which creates this remarkable body of sources on musical life. The article that is pictured on the slide here is on a competition for children's choirs, actually, that took place in the Warsaw Ghetto in September of 1941. I also use accounts of musical life in diaries, testimonies, and memoirs from the ghetto or from ghetto survivors. Most of these sources, especially the archival sources, are in Yiddish or Polish and remain untranslated. Therefore, most of the translations throughout this talk are my own. Using these sources, I draw on methodologies from the field of sound studies, which looks at sound in a given environment and its interactions with power. And I'm really looking at the intersections of sound, bodies, and power in space, and the production of meaning through that process to analyze discourses surrounding music and musicians in the ghetto. While ghetto residents generally could not significantly alter their physical environment, they could and did use sound, especially music, to hourly define the purpose of spaces they occupied and to mentally escape their terrible circumstances, at least temporarily. A brief overview of the sort of broader stakes of the project. This is the first comprehensive study of musical life in the Warsaw Ghetto. So I'm seeking not only to expand our knowledge of music's social and cultural roles during war and genocide, this project also demonstrates music's near ubiquity as a form of cultural expression and response to persecution, one that crosses multiple demographic lines, including age, class, gender, level of education, religiosity, politics, and so forth. It therefore enables comparison across all of these categories. My research also builds on scholarship in the history of the senses, bringing attention to auditory experience of war and genocide, an underexplored topic in the history of Eastern Europe, Russia, and the Soviet Union. My project seeks to transform our understanding of how the victims of persecution and genocide perceive, understand, and attempt to shape their world and experiences, particularly by demonstrating the profound continuities and practices of their practices of cultural expression to endure against violence and persecution. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I conclude that ghetto residents used music to engage with global political discourses at the intersection of aesthetics, identity, and morality, as we'll see a little bit today, to assert their belonging within Eastern Europe or Europe at large, and to negotiate their individual and community relationship and identity, their relationship specifically with modernity and the modern city. Music was a way that they sought to work out and assert what their place was in this world, and to define the nature of their community, essentially, which is truly a remarkable process to see in the midst of a genocide. Turning now to the diversity of music in the ghetto. Because of the ghetto's size and the diversity of communities interned there, and because there was, for a time, space for a significant cultural sphere within its walls, the Warsaw Ghetto offers a particularly rich case study of music and cultural life during the Holocaust. Indeed, despite desperate material circumstances, residents produced an outpouring of cultural creativity. Music was performed across a very wide range of social and economic contexts, ranging from beggars who busked for coins and food on the ghetto streets to formal concerts by the ghetto's symphony orchestra. One of the conductors of that symphony orchestra is pictured here, Szymon Pullman, on the right-hand side, as well as revues and cabarets at nightclubs patronized by the sort of thin stratum of the ghetto's sort of society who were relatively wealthy and powerful, mainly people involved in smuggling. Some performers, like the singer and actress Diana Blumenfeld, or the pianist Władysław Szpilman, the subject of the 2002 film The Pianist, both pictured here, had successful pre-war careers. But some of the ghetto's exceptional musicians, like the wildly popular young soprano Marysia Eisenstadt, also pictured here, only came to prominence within its walls. Blumenfeld and Szpilman both survived the war, but the other two pictured here did not. We don't know much about Pullman's fate, but we do know Eisenstadt's, and hers was more typical of musicians in the ghetto. She was fatally shot in August of 1942 during the Great Deportation to Treblinka. She was only 21 years old. Given this diversity of musicians and musical expression present, the project encompasses a very wide range of musical genres and contexts. And in each of these genres and contexts, different meanings accrued to the music that was performed. So chapter 1 of the project provides background on Jewish musical life and institutions in interwar Poland. Chapter 2 looks at the ghetto's Jewish Symphony Orchestra and classical music in the ghetto, debates around so-called low or high culture, and the politics of repertoire, particularly what was Jewish music and what it meant to perform Jewish music under such circumstances. Chapter 3, the focus of today's talk, examines music in children's lives. Chapter 4 looks at music performed in the ghetto's restaurants, cafés, and cabarets. And finally, chapter 5 examines music performed by beggars in the ghetto streets and courtyards. I'm also working on an interlude section on religious music. There's very little documentation that survives, but there is some, and I'd like to incorporate that into the larger project as well. So now I want to turn to the bulk of my talk for today and discuss the musical experiences of children in the ghetto as a case study. Jewish children's experiences during the Holocaust remain relatively underexamined. This has multiple causes, including the sort of broader long-term neglect of women and children as subjects of conventional history. But in the specific case of the Holocaust, a lack of available sources is a very significant impediment. While scholarship employing the testimonies of child survivors has burgeoned in recent years, following broader scholarly trends, embracing approaches like oral history, the overwhelming majority of European Jewish children perished in the Holocaust and typically left few traces. Certainly, if they did not survive, they could not provide survivor testimony. However, again, in the case of the Warsaw Ghetto, we are fortunate in that there is a rich corpus of documentary evidence from the time, including documents written or dictated by children themselves, and we'll see a few of those documents later today. The organization Oyneg Shabbos made gathering information on children-specific experiences a priority, even collecting children's school assignments. And many documents attest to the importance of music for children in the ghetto and to its multiple roles, some of which I'll talk about today, including education, caretaking or providing respite and relief to children, and the process of using music to shape children into future Jewish adults. By examining the roles music played in children's lives, it's possible to uncover not only how aid workers and organizations attempted to save the ghetto's children, but also to reveal traces of children's subjectivity and agency. As both performers and audience members, children became active participants in the ghetto's campaigns to save and to shape a future Jewish generation. Additionally, by looking at children's interactions with music, especially within the frameworks of the ghetto's Jewish aid organizations, we can see how much those organizations' work was oriented towards cultural survival, not just physical survival. Whether this meant the preservation of pre-war cultural norms, strengthening children's ties to Yiddish language and culture, or preparing children for a hoped-for future in the land of Israel. Aid organizations, leaders, sponsors, and workers saw music as something actively salutary and beneficial to children, something healthy, essentially, an essential element of raising them into Jewish adults and to ameliorate their mental state. For some activists, of course, this was also a nationalist project. Scholars of nationalism like Tara Zara and Sharon Stevens have argued that children are often key objects of nationalizing endeavors, motivated out of fear that children who aren't raised and educated properly in the nation can be lost to that nation. The Holocaust, of course, was a catastrophic rupture in the heated interwar era debates and disputes over the nature of Jewish identity and nationhood, whether it was national or otherwise, in Europe. But those disputes did not actually cease. Rather, they took on newly existential dimensions amidst the Holocaust. And crucially, these struggles involved, how essentially to mold Jewish children into Jewish adults. In the Warsaw Ghetto, music became essential to these efforts. Music, of course, also provided a much-needed psychological pressure valve for children, as well as the adults who worked with them. Aid organizations, teachers, caregivers, and activists all used music to claim physical space and time for Jewish children in the ghetto to be children. Music could create sort of therapeutic spaces while strengthening the children's attachment to particular visions or forms of Jewish identity and promoting visions of an idealized Jewish future. So in short, music served many purposes in children's lives, and children acted as both audience members and performers. As well as in education, it was used to raise money for destitute refugee children and to support other charitable causes, and of course served as entertainment. But even performances meant to entertain, as we'll see, served as a form of active caregiving. Such concerts offered a space and time where children, upon whom the ghetto's horrors weighed so heavily, could find some measure of relief. Children's welfare presented a central challenge for ghetto authorities. First, they were a significant portion of the population. Even in January 1942, after well over a year of hunger and disease ravaging the ghetto's population, there were still roughly 100,000 children under 14 in the ghetto out of, at the time, a total population of around 369,000. So well over a quarter of the population was under 14. Second, children's suffering was particularly visible and particularly painful to witness. Diaries, reports, and other documents from the ghetto repeatedly attest to the great psychological pain that adults experienced seeing starving and suffering children on a daily basis. And indeed, witnessing children's suffering and their death meant witnessing the death of the embodiment of the community's future. Nusen Koninsky, who was a member of Oynig Shabbos, wrote in 1941 a report called The Face of the Jewish Child, Oblicze Dziecka Żydowskiego. The first couple pages of it are pictured here, in which he wrote, realizing that children constitute a society's future, that this generation will grow to embrace our legacy and continue to live in accordance with our desires and aims, it is easy to understand the enormity of the tragedy that the Jewish community is experiencing as a result of the lamentable, catastrophic situation of the child. Multiple ghetto organizations were involved in children's welfare, several of which employed music for their ends. In general, financial and other forms of aid in the Warsaw Ghetto fell into two broad categories. that provided by the Judenrat, or Jewish Council, which was the ghetto's official Jewish leadership, and that provided by semi-official or outright illegal organizations that were not affiliated with the Judenrat. And it is this latter category that I'm focusing on today. The Judenrat did use music as part of its efforts to help children, but I'm focusing much more on the sort of unofficial organizations today. In this latter category, the most important institutions working with children were the Jewish Self-Help, or Alleenhilf, a mutual aid association, and Centos, the Central Organization for Orphan Care, which was actually founded in 1924. The Self-Help was a wartime organization, but Centos had a long prehistory. I believe it was actually founded to help Jewish orphans and children who'd lost one parent after the First World War. With financial support from the American Joint Distribution Committee, at least initially openly and later covertly, the Jewish Self-Help organized, streamlined, and funded other social institutions, anchoring the webs of Jewish mutual aid and community life that helped not only sustain the ghetto and its residents, but produce space in which cultural life could take place. In general, the Self-Help and its related organizations worked to establish spaces in which Jewish children could find food, shelter, and sometimes help with basic hygiene. However, they were not only concerned with material survival. In part, their work was an active continuation of pre-World War II forms of Polish Jewish communal life. When it came to children, part of this work of survival was mitigating the emotional and psychological damage caused by the ghetto environment. And these aid organizations found an opportunity to do just that through cultural events, particularly music. So first, I want to talk a bit about music's role in education in the ghetto. Educating the ghetto's children was one of the most crucial tasks of both the official Jewish leadership and the ghetto's mutual aid and charitable organizations, and one in which they faced significant legal hurdles. German orders had shut down Jewish schools shortly after the invasion of Poland. With those schools shuttered and their property requisitioned, roughly 40,000 Jewish children between 7 and 14 years old were out of school in Warsaw alone. The Judenrat and Jewish authorities made repeated entreaties to the German authorities, but to little avail. To Warsaw's Jewish leaders, this was an urgent crisis with consequences not only for children in the present, but for their community's future as well. However, those leaders did not agree on what form that education should take. Stakeholders in this debate involved a range of pre-war Jewish educational organizations, including CISHO, the Central Yiddish School Organization, affiliated with leftist and socialist parties like the Bund and Left Koalition, which was essentially labor Zionists, as well as Tarbut, which ran secular Hebrew language schools associated with the General Zionist political party. While they awaited approval from the German authorities, leaders from these school movements debated the form and content of Jewish education in occupied Warsaw, especially the language of instruction and whether the schools should be nationalist or religious or perhaps both. To them, these were not mere questions of pedagogical theory, but had much broader implications for how these leaders envisioned the form of the Jewish community and its embodiment in Jewish children. It was only in September 1941 that, nearly 2 years after the schools had initially been shut down, that the Warsaw Judenrat received permission to reopen some elementary schools. But by this time, an extensive network of underground education was well established, organized through bodies like CISHO and Tarbut, political parties, social and mutual aid organizations, as well as, for those who could afford it, private tutors. Music became a frequent presence in clandestine and eventually legally permitted schools. In the absence of proper classrooms, books, or supplies, children could still be taught songs. After all, this only required a teacher who knew the song in question. Additionally, it's plausible that teaching children songs could be passed off as a non-educational childcare activity and thus not a violation of the ban on education. While songs and music would not necessarily impart knowledge of basic skills such as reading, writing, or mathematics, they were certainly used to teach children other lessons. lessons that were less focused on concrete skills and more on psychological resilience, individual and community survival, and a sense of Jewish identity. In the case of at least 3 schools operated by Tzisho, music was officially part of the curriculum. Onik Shabbos preserved this copy pictured here of a care and teaching plan for 3 of Tzisho's what were called kitchen schools. These were sites that provided children with supplementary nutrition as a cover for clandestine schooling. And we'll come back to one of these schools in particular later and hear from actually some of the children who attended it. Among these institutions' goals, this plan identified protection of the spiritual life of the child, and I'm quoting here, encouraging the children's feelings of friendliness, sociability, and responsibility, as well as cultivating their love for and attachment to the Yiddish language and culture. And music was a planned element of achieving these goals. The part highlighted in red on the second page there, I quote again, "We sing songs with the children and teach them to recite texts in various ways by performing stories and songs," the plan states, alongside instructions for lessons on Yiddish literature and good personal hygiene. Hygiene was very important. Yiddish folk songs and musical settings of texts by famous Yiddish authors helped foster pupils' connections with Yiddish culture. Yet children's and teachers' accounts indicate that music also fulfilled the school's aim of protecting the children's spiritual lives, for it was in music that children could find some temporary psychological respite. The choice of organizations like Tzisho and Centos to focus on children's emotional as well as physical needs meant that there was significant overlap between children's welfare and education on the one hand, and their cultural enrichment and entertainment on the other. And in many cases, it's impossible to really separate these tasks out because they coexisted in a sort of symbiosis. By examining the varied functions of music in this environment, this symbiotic relationship becomes clear, as in the case of an event held on May 24th of 1941, when a commemoration of the Yiddish writer Wael Peretz's 26th yahrzeit took place, the commemoration of the anniversary of his death. This was part of a series of events celebrating Peretz, all taking place around the same time, but this particular event prominently included children. Both as part of the performance, a children's choir performed songs by Peretz, and in the audience. Now, the program, which is pictured on this slide, and that's the entire program, it's pretty bare bones, lists adult speakers and performers by name, first initial and last name, alongside a Yiddish children's choir and rhythmic dancing. However, because we do have the adults' names, we can establish their professional affiliations, and this broadly helps to indicate the event's ideological background. Those who were not professional musicians or actors were mainly activists involved with Centos, Yikor, which was a clandestine cultural organization promoting Yiddish language and culture, and or Tzisho. The event itself was likely organized by Centos, probably in cooperation with his umbrella organization, the Jewish Self-Help, as the event took place in the Self-Help's headquarters. So this program gives us some information, but not a whole lot. As I mentioned, what's pictured here is the entire thing that we have. This is the only part of the program that's preserved. However, we do have another source. 3 children who attended this event, Cheniek Ziegelman, Chaim Glustein, and one child whose name was not preserved, recorded their experiences at this event in short essays archived by Onik Shabbos. And these are truly remarkable sources. It's so rare to have documents actually written by a child from the time. These children most likely attended one of the Tzisho kitchen schools, known as the Borochov Kitchen School, located at 68 Novolipki Street, given their references to the involvement of a teacher of theirs who we know taught at that school. Their essay structure and contents suggest the students were actually given a school assignment to describe their performances. Each child described in some detail and in sequential order what they saw at the Peretz ceremony. And in this sense, these are very familiar documents. You know, I can remember being about 7 years old and going to a performance and getting an assignment to do something like this. You know, first this happened and then this happened, and it was really nice. And it's essentially what they have to say. It's kind of lovely. Based on the children's reports, the ceremony opened with spring songs by parrots performed by the Warsaw Kitchen School's children's choir. Next, Yikor activists gave speeches on parrots, and one of their teachers read some of parrots' stories and poems. Children from the kitchen school performed 2 dances, and a woman addressed only as Comrade Sorla, Chava Sorla, performed a song or songs by parrots. The actor Isaac Samberg told one of parrots' stories, and the program closed with another performance by the children's choir. Ultimately, however, these specific details are less revealing of the event's purpose than the children's accounts of their emotional states and reactions, as well as what they recorded regarding the larger moral content of the event. For instance, Glustein, describing one of the speeches, wrote that the speaker emphasized, and the speech was on parrots' work for Jewish communities during World War I. The speaker emphasized, and I quote, what parrots did for Jewish children. Parrots also gave the people courage in order that they should survive the First World War. These accounts suggested the event organizers praised parrots not only as a writer, but a moral example of activism relevant to their times, when care for Jewish children and for the hungry were genuinely matters of life and death, both individually and for the community as a whole. In discussing World War I, the speaker also implicitly linked present Jewish suffering to past Jewish suffering and suggested the past as a model for Jewish survival. In this sense, both the speeches at the parrot ceremony and the songs the children sang were meant to offer them knowledge of and connection to Jewish history as a sort of survival tool. Additionally, with its pedagogical bent, this event was part of the organizers' project of educating Jewish children into Jewish adults with parrots as a model of identity and morality. However, it's noteworthy to see that after all of the lectures, Glustein, for instance, wrote, the audience was, quote, very satisfied and felt very free, and they entirely forgot about their sorrows. Ziegelman wrote, similarly, the people were happy and courageous and spoke of, feelings of confidence. This suggests that the parrot ceremony was not convened merely for the sake of entertainment or even survival-oriented education. Rather, it provided respite from the depredations of the ghetto, a sense of uplift, and a temporary and therapeutic mental retreat from reality. Ziegelman, Glustein, and the unnamed child were not the only pupils at the Warsaw Kitchen School whose writing was preserved. Oinig Shabbos also collected a series of essays written by pupils on their everyday lives in the school, offering an extraordinary, and again, I can't emphasize enough how rare this is, a rare window into children's experiences of education in the ghetto and their social and emotional worlds. In general, their compositions report very favorably on the school. Of the 19 essays preserved, 7 discuss music, and all but one of those discuss it in unambiguously positive terms. It's possible that the one that's a little ambiguous was positive, but as you can see here, the pages were damaged, and so it's not always possible to read all of the text. In fact, music is perhaps rivaled only by the children's discussion of regular bathing and hygiene as a marker of how their experiences at the kitchen school improved their lives. One child, for instance, described singing beautiful songs among their positive impressions of the school. Another, Zelik Kristal, whose essay is pictured here, wrote that he felt happier and more at home or more home-like in the school, heimlicher, because people sang various songs. I wanted to be there all day. I am very happy there, he wrote. He particularly enjoyed singing, as well as the teacher's lessons on the Yiddish author Shalom Aleichem. And after lessons at a meal, Kristal wrote he did not want to go home, where conditions were not so happy as in the school. Another student, Dora Blashka, contrasted an earlier period in the kitchen school when the children had no supervision and wandered from between empty rooms, with a much happier present when the teacher, in addition to reading Yiddish literature to the children, taught them songs. For Blashka, this was what distinguished the Warsaw Kitchen School from the ghetto's single-purpose aid kitchens and really elevated it. Another child's unsigned account suggests that this improvement that Blashka described occurred with the seasons. The warmer weather of spring and summer had brought children to the kitchen school, actively hoping for education, and its rooms, the child wrote, were decorated with beautiful pictures and flowers. The teacher, this child wrote, focused particularly on helping students who lived in dark and hungry homes where to benefit from the kitchen school, where, and I quote, children accomplished various tasks, articles were written on various subjects, songs were learned and sung, and an atmosphere of love for children was created. This was all part, according to these children, of an intensive effort to transform this kitchen into a place of sort of cheerfulness and a sense of reciprocal love. This anonymous child indeed explicitly described the school as a space deliberately transformed by music and learning. Here, music was part of a range of activities that helped define the kitchen school for the children as a space of happiness, cleanliness, and health, of respite from starvation, and of joy, however brief. So with this overview of how music operated in Sisho schools, I'm going to turn briefly to Tarbut schools as well. Tarbut schools are a bit less well documented in the Oynig Shabbos archive, most likely because Emanuel Ringelblum himself was a dedicated Yiddishist, and Tarbut schools were Hebrew language and pretty strictly Hebrew language schools. However, we do have a fair amount of documentation on the Tarbut schools, thanks to one of the men pictured on this slide, Kopel Pijits, who was involved in these schools. Much like the Sisho schools, Tarbut schools initially operated illegally in Centos-run children's kitchens. And much like the Sisho schools, they also extensively used music. And Pijits, one of our best sources on this, actually helped to organize children's choirs in these schools. Initially, his intention was to create these choirs to help the schools essentially fundraise and to sort of gather support and enthusiasm for their mission from people living in the area just around the schools. But the choirs rapidly took on pedagogical value as well. The best known Tarbut school choir was led by Israel Fajvicius, also pictured here with his fantastic widow's peak. He was a respected conductor and composer from Łódź, another Polish city. Pijits, in his writings, praised the pedagogical value of Fajvicius's work with the students. And I quote, his tutelage developed in them, in addition to musicality, fluency in the Hebrew language and knowledge of Palestinian musical literature. And they even became acquainted to a certain degree with the life of the Palestinian Jew, a life so diametrically opposed to our life in the diaspora. In one case, Pijits even described the choir's concerts mentally transporting the audience to Palestine or perhaps paradise. Listeners, he wrote, were touched by songs that smelled of Palestine, infusing them with freedom. Flowering paradises drowning in sun passed before their eyes, fields and garden cities. While Pijits' evocative phrasing was likely colored by his own ideological views, his description illuminates the goals and ideals of the organizers to develop in both students and audience members an affinity with the Hebrew language and with the land of Israel. Pijits went on to describe how the children's chorus's performances affected their audiences explicitly in terms of the space in which the performance took place. And I quote, when the whole elite of the ghetto gathered to listen to the children's choral singing and solos, the Hebrew language ruling over the stage and dominating the building generated the ideal atmosphere for propagating Tarbut's ideas. Through the Hebrew language, the music that the children's choirs performed refashioned the space inside the building. Recalling a Hanukkah celebration that featured one of the children's choirs, Pijits went even further, describing how the music generated a chance for mental escape, and I quote here at length. That evening allowed our guests to shift their thoughts from grim reality, from the horror of our everyday lives, to a land of the most beautiful memories and the innermost dreams. We forgot the poverty and tragedy of the Jewish street, and with our eyes open wide, we looked at the exquisite fairy tale of Hanukkah that was spun before us. And we did not now hear the voices of street children, their songs with the repeated motif, Patrachmunas, in Yiddish, have pity, but the powerful, clear, victorious melody of Ma'ot Sur Yeshuati resounded in our ears. The hope blossomed in our hearts that for us, the Hanukkah miracle would repeat. The choice of the Piyut Ma'otzur in this passage is noteworthy. This is a song celebrating Jewish survival, and not just survival, but armed rebellion in the face of violence, listing past oppressors and calling for God's aid in vanquishing foes. The contrast between the street children begging for pity in Yiddish and the triumphant sound of the Hebrew Ma'otzur highlights the contrast between the interior and exterior of the kitchen school, a difference produced by music. The performance offered hope for redemption in a manner entirely consistent with Tarbut's Zionist ideology. The street outside was home to all of the diaspora's misery, in their view, while the Hebrew language performance inside offered hope for a miracle. The blossoming hope that, as he wrote, the Hanukkah miracle would repeat, therefore takes on a dual meaning. First, it implicitly parallels the Hasmoneans defeated the Greeks in the Hanukkah story with the ghetto audience's desire to survive the Nazis. Second, Pishit's linked Jewish suffering and helplessness, the cries of the street children embodying that, with the Yiddish language. Through the phrase "Hotrachmunis," a phrase that may actually reference a real song from the ghetto, and through Yiddish with the diaspora, contrasting it with the Hebrew song Ma'otzur. In general, in their kitchen schools, both Sisho and Tarbut employed music to approach the Jewish past and future, albeit in different ways and in accordance with their different views of Jewish identity. Sisho focused on grounding children in Yiddish language and culture and on providing them emotional relief from their immediate surroundings. Meanwhile, Tarbut's kitchen schools used music to mentally transport children, as well as the adults who worked with them, to a hoped-for Jewish future in the land of Israel. In both cases, they used music, especially music rooted in specific visions of the Jewish past, to encourage the development of children's Jewish identities. Especially in the context of the ghetto, these children represented their hopes for the Jewish future, and music was an essential tool in shaping that future. So, final example today, I want to talk about another context, a related context in which music entered children's lives, which was in the context of childcare and relief work. Despite earlier limited successes, by the autumn of 1941, the degree to which the ghetto's problems outstripped the ability of mutual aid organizations to solve them, or really of anyone to solve them, had become painfully clear. This was not the result of anyone's, failure of effort. It was a problem of the staggering mismatch between aid workers' capabilities and the enormity of the problems at hand. As conditions in the ghetto worsened, including bitterly cold weather and a raging typhus epidemic, children's suffering was further intensified. Under such circumstances, musical events for children did not stop, but their scale and effectiveness became more limited. Still, music had a role to play in Centos-run daycares, where it was a psychological balm and a draw for impoverished and orphaned children. The child B. Steinmann, whose essay is pictured here, was around 12 years old in September of 1941 when she either wrote or dictated her response to a questionnaire given to students at a daycare located at 25 Nobolipki Street in the Warsaw Ghetto. By the time a friend of hers suggested Steinmann seek out the daycare, her family had sold all of their possessions to support themselves, and they were in desperate circumstances. Life, now that she attended the daycare, was a vast improvement. "I'm enjoying it there now," Steinmann wrote. "We work, sing songs, and get meals 4 times a day." Anja Baranek, another child around the same age as Steinmann, gave a strikingly similar account of the war's effects on her family. Like Steinmann, she'd lived a reasonably comfortable life before the war, but in the ghetto, her mother could no longer work and had sold everything they owned in a futile attempt to earn a living. Her admittance into the same daycare was similarly transformative. She wrote, "I'm very happy there now. We learn, we sing songs." Their accounts suggest that children actively sought out such facilities, not just for food and safety, but for the happiness that they found and the purpose they found in music and other activities there. The accounts of caregivers at Centos-run daycares from a few months later, that those children's accounts are from September, but a few months later in December of 1941, offer a point of comparison. Excuse me. Music was not the focus of these caregivers' reports. Generally, they focused on children's extremely poor material circumstances and the absolute inadequacy of the available resources to help them. Yet they also recounted how they made the most of what few resources they did have. Some accounts suggest that teaching the children songs was particularly useful because it did not require any additional material, such as books, papers, or even furniture. Two daycare workers in their report described how, despite what they called nightmarish conditions, they worked to socialize the children. Because there were no tables or chairs, they said children do not draw and do not write, but older children would sit and listen to lectures, while younger children, they wrote, sang, and happily played. Another daycare worker wrote that when children received food at the daycare every day, their interest in the world vastly increased. While before, any effort to sing with them was met with questions on when they would receive bread. Once fed, she wrote, the children were singing even in a good mood. Noemi Danielova, whose report's pictured here, worked at a daycare at 2 Miła Street in the ghetto. She named two songs she sang with the children, Choć burza huczy and Wein nicht jingle. The first song is clearly Choć burza huczy wkoło nas, though the storm roars around us, a Polish mariner's song. The lyrics strongly suggest that the song was intended as encouragement, including lines such as, though a storm roars around us, we lift our heads up high, the storm does not frighten us. The latter song is most likely a setting of the Polish and Yiddish writer Moritz Schimmel or Moishe Schimmel's poem Es kommen Leute Tag, clearer days are coming. And in much the same way, this is a poem that offers reassurance that suffering will pass and better times will come in the future. From their reports, these daycare workers were concerned with meeting the children's most basic survival needs, and they often did not have the resources to do even that. But that makes it even more remarkable that some caregivers did find the time and ability to provide some basic education and socialization for their charges. It also, however, suggests that a certain level of basic well-being was necessary for children to find respite in music. When children were sick and starving, no amount of singing could bring them relief. To conclude, the Warsaw Ghetto's residents exerted tremendous effort to care for children, whose suffering constituted the ghetto's most visible and agonizing social problem, as well as a direct threat to the Jewish community's future. Their efforts were not simply focused on mere physical survival, however. They also used music and performance to foster children's sense of Jewish identity and to provide respite for them from the ghetto's horrors. Those who planned, taught, and organized events themselves benefited as well. By caring for children, adults not only worked to reduce rates of disease, despair, starvation, and death among children, but they also resisted the destruction of Warsaw's Jewish community. By giving children the opportunity to laugh, encouraging them to develop a sense of connection with Jewish history and moral strength through Peretz's oeuvre, or by breaking the law to ensure that they received an education, these activists fought to preserve the embodiment of their community's future. In these efforts, music was central. To raise money, to entertain, to give children a sense of belonging and communal connection, and to facilitate education when they lacked even the most basic of materials. Ultimately, children's institutions in the Warsaw Ghetto were doomed, but their efforts, at least temporarily, were not entirely in vain. For a short time, Syszo and Tarbut schools and Sentos daycares were something of a refuge for the children who spent time there. Especially at the schools, music could provide joy and entertainment, but it was also part of efforts to preserve both a physical and cultural future for Jews. As in the Peretz ceremony or the Tarbut school choir's concerts, music helped promote a sense of communal affiliation and fostered feelings of identification with Jewish history. These institutions not only wanted the children to survive, they wanted them to survive as Jews. And in an environment where education, an essential means of inculcating identity, was for the most part illegal, teachers resorted to music to communicate a sense of belonging. Finally, music gave these children an opportunity, however brief and limited, to exercise some degree of agency in their own fate. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions in our discussion.
Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you so much for this fascinating, informative, and much needed presentation. And I'm sure we'll have questions as we anticipate questions from the audience. allow me just to say that while I'm not at all an expert in this area, but from what I know and understand, this work that you're doing adds very important dimensions to our knowledge of and understanding of Jewish cultural life, survival and death in the ghettos, and perhaps also in some camps, if you think of Theresienstadt. And I know that, for instance, a lot of work by musicologists has focused on individual talent, on performers and composers. For instance, if one thinks of the Warsaw Ghetto, of course, you'll see work on Władysław Szpilman, right? And you'll see work on the other Władysław, Schlengel, who actually died in the uprising. And of course, in the case of, say, the Łódź Ghetto, there's very interesting work. I'm thinking of Gila Flam's work on music in the Łódź Ghetto. But I think what you're doing is, if I understand it correctly, is different because your emphasis is on what you referred to. And I really like that expression, the ubiquity of music, that it is not just about individual talent and the survival of performers and composers. It's on the way music plays a role, perhaps central role in, on the one hand, educating Jewish children, but on the other hand, providing some modicum of relief. Music as therapy. And I find sort of that intersection particularly refreshing, but I think also challenging. And I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that, and specifically how your approach differs from some of the other work on, and also, of course, I meant to say, of course, when it comes to, say, the Vilna Ghetto, we, again, know a fair amount about songwriters, but this is not what you're doing.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for that. I think that's a really great observation. And this very much does reflect what I'm trying to do. I'm really interested in, I do talk about individuals, of course, and there are many fascinating individuals, including some who really don't get a lot of treatment in the literature. But I'm really much more interested in sort of the whole community and the way that music permeated and became sort of part of the texture of that community and its life. I'm interested in, I do a lot of piecing together bits and pieces from different people's diaries and memoirs and other documents and showing these sort of broader patterns of how people were experiencing and perceiving music. And I do want to note, and this is, in part, I think, an artifact of the particular area I was focusing on in the talk today, music was not just a form of relief. It could also be a very negative experience in some cases as well. For many people in the ghetto, music was not necessarily something they chose to hear. It could be, there was forced music making. Germans would enter the ghetto and force performers to perform things for them for their entertainment. But there were also beggars whose songs were essentially a way to draw attention to their suffering. And these songs were, and cries, often cries of suffering, could be very painful for people to hear, very uncomfortable for them to hear as well. So yes, I think you're correct in characterizing the project in this way, that I am much more looking at sort of a broader communal processes of how this music was produced and what it meant for people. Sometimes that means looking through individual stories and individual sources, but it's not so much focused on individual biography. Yeah. I would say also my background is as a historian, not as a musicologist. I do have training as a musical performer. I have training as a classical violist, although I don't perform anymore. And so that, I definitely have a background in music. I have some training there. And I'm incredibly indebted to my colleagues in musicology who've over the years given me, tremendously helpful feedback on different parts of this project. But I very much am approaching this as a historian who's interested, perhaps not so much in the notes on the page, although not every musicologist is looking at notes on the page, and more at sort of cultural and social context around music, what people are saying and thinking about it.
Yeah, thank you for that. And if I could just pick up on that, and I think what I also really appreciated is the extent to which you, in your presentation, I guess, circumvented or eschewed the inevitable distinction between low culture and high culture. And the question is, of course, how do we make that distinction? I'm thinking here in Boston, which is sort of one of the principal basis for the study of music in Theresienstadt, because of the work of my colleague Mark Ludwig, who is, by the way, a former violist at the BSO, and who has a foundation, and he's dedicated his life to collecting and promoting the legacy of music composed and performed in Theresienstadt. But you're looking there at very important composers who were spearheading it, people like Hans Krasa, for instance. And I think even if we don't make the distinction makes itself for us. These are highly trained, very important composers who are sort of leading the effort. It seems that something is different in your work, and I wonder if you could expand on that as well. And it interests me very much.
Yeah, so I'm actually very conscious in my work that I don't seek to make in my own analysis, I'm not particularly interested in separating out high and low culture. I do talk about it when the people living in the ghetto are talking about it, because they, in some cases, not all, but in some cases, very much cared about that distinction. It was incredibly important to them. I actually do want to note, as a side note, I almost included this in the presentation, ended up cutting it for time, but I'm actually, because I'm influenced by methodologies from sound studies, there are areas where I am deliberately not drawing a clear line between noise and sound versus music, because that distinction itself is a subjective one and one that's dependent upon aesthetic judgment. And so there are areas in this project where I am deliberately exploring that boundary and including analysis of what seems pretty clearly to be non-musical noise alongside music itself as part of the sort of larger sonic texture of the ghetto, to sort of understand what people actually heard as part of their daily lives in the ghetto.
So I wonder actually if you could perhaps, if not just my sake, but the sake of some members of the audience, expand a little bit of that. So let me ask you a question, for instance, hypothetically. Does it mean that, let's say, if you had testimony about the way a children's group is singing, and they're all singing out of tune, and they're not singing particularly well, is that a distinction that would be of interest to you, as opposed to, a perfectly, or, perfectly choreographed, perfectly chiseled, performance, flawless performance?
It would be very much so of interest to me, particularly the way that people were talking about it. So I mentioned people did care very much about or at least some people did, about the quality of performances. And this is something people very much were discussing and writing about, and in some cases very angrily writing about. In this area of the project, I'm actually inspired a bit by the work of Ruth Hacohen, whose book, The Music Libel Against the Jews, is a really excellent exploration of this. There's a long, long history of Jews being associated with unwanted noise and sort of the opposite of harmony, unharmonious sound, while Christianity, of course, is the source of all harmony, right? And there is especially we can see starting in the Enlightenment era, a real concentrated effort by Jews to counter this accusation and prove that Jews can be producers of harmonious and beautiful sound. And this is something that very much continues on in the ghetto, and for at least some stakeholders, especially those who are, sort of highly educated and coming out of sort of the background of the intelligentsia, they were still very much motivated to prove that, yes, Jews can be producers of aesthetic beauty, including in music. Figures like Shimon Pullman, actually, who I mentioned, really interesting guy, trained in Vienna and worked in Vienna for most of his career before the war. His family was from Warsaw, and he happened to be visiting them in late August of 1939 and was trapped in the city when the war began. But he very much came from this sort of Central European, musical background, and worked very hard with the orchestra to sort of bring them up to a level of performance, very much a high culture values essentially at work there, stemming from this kind of belief that Jews need to prove that they can do it, not even just as well, but actually better than everyone else. And in some cases, this even extended to, in particular, performances of German repertoire, especially Beethoven, who was actually the most performed composer in the ghetto, based on the statistics that I've been able to collect. And these claims that some writers were actually advancing that, essentially Germans have forfeited their right to this music and Jews are now the true inheritors of it. But to truly inherit it means having to perform it well, to perform it beautifully. So for some people, this really was important. For others, it was less the quality of the music that they performed and more that they were using music, for a beggar, for instance, for being able to perform beautiful music might bring them more positive attention, but using music at all could be more of a matter of producing sound and bringing attention to their suffering, their plight, and thereby, sort of almost extorting alms from people. So it's not a simple either or, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Absolutely. It really depends upon context. But I really try to incorporate all of these different sorts of registers in the project because they're all part of that sonic environment.
Right. Well, as a cultural historian of the Shoah, although my work mainly deals with the occupied territories, but I am always curious and interested in two things. What was the initial impulse behind the research? And two, where you did most of your collecting of the evidence, because I've so appreciated the extent to which you base your arguments very closely on surviving documents, as opposed to, kind of broader accounts or secondary accounts. This is original research.
Yeah, thank you for that. So my interest in music and the Holocaust broadly actually stems back to me being a very weird child. I was maybe 9 or 10 years old, and I actually happened to hear the music of one of those composers from Theresienstadt, actually from Terezin that you mentioned, Pavel Haas,
right,
on National Public Radio. And I made my mom buy me a recording. She was very confused by this, but I was enchanted by this music and I wanted to learn more. And it was something I eventually, it sort of stayed in the back of my head. There was no information for a 9-year-old. There's hardly any information available at the time anyway, but certainly
that's right. It was a while, yeah, of course.
This was a while ago, but I came back to it in college actually and wrote my undergraduate thesis on sort of music and the Holocaust broadly. And even then found a lot of the existing literature to not be quite satisfying. It essentially, I felt like there's so much more here still to discover, and ultimately decided I wanted to go to grad school to do more work on this. And that was what really motivated me. I was actually the rest of the answer to this question also answers your second question, which is that I was drawn to Warsaw specifically by the archival sources. I did my initial pre-dissertation research and then later much of my dissertation research at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, where many of these documents are preserved, particularly the Oinig Shabbos, the Ringelblum archive, is located there. And these are truly, I constantly feel incredibly lucky as a historian to have the opportunity to work with documents like this that are not only, produced by people at the time, but produced by people who have a consciousness of history and of scholarship and of the need to provide documentation to future scholars. Mm-hmm. And that this purpose was very much at work in the collecting that they did of documents. And so we have such a wide range of documents. But essentially what I found is I went to this archive. I said, I'm interested in music. They said, well, we don't have any. And I said, okay, can you let me look at these documents anyway? And they said, okay, fine. And I started finding pages and pages and pages and pages of stuff on music. It's just, there weren't necessarily notes on the page, but there were people writing about music. And through a lot of essentially patient work and sifting through, sort of unlikely possibilities and learning what sort of terms in a finding aid might lead me to something, I slowly put together essentially a lot of documents. This was a lot of work, and they're still, I'm still doing it essentially. But what I essentially found is more and more and more accounts from people at the time or from writing immediately after the war, talking in great detail about music and about their musical experiences, and then finding commonalities across these. It was, immediately clear to me that there are some pretty clear themes which are borne out in the project itself. So yeah, essentially it was the documents that led me there. So I did a lot of my research in Poland. I also spent some time at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. and at YIVO in New York City. But yeah, that's where the bulk of my research has been done. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's truly fascinating. And I just want to tell you how much I enjoyed it and how much I learned, and really looking forward to your book.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I guess almost in closing, and I don't want to force this question because these questions have a way of feeling forced, but you did mention in your opening that perhaps this experience is relevant to the events we are living through and observing with trepidation, the experience of the suffering, particularly of children in wartime Ukraine. And I wonder if you would be comfortable just perhaps talking a little bit about it. And like I said, I really don't want to force you into it.
Yeah. I appreciate your hesitance on this because it is a difficult question, and historians are always nervous about making too direct a comparison, especially a comparison with the Holocaust, which is
absolutely
an incredibly fraught thing to compare anything with.
100%. I am in agreement 100%.
I certainly don't want to say that these things are the same, but I noticed very, very quickly, starting at the really as early as last February, I recognized essentially patterns that I'd identified in my own research with the work that Ukrainians and people working with Ukrainian refugees are doing with children, and the value of cultural work and music for those children as a way to essentially this idea of giving them back their childhood, the way that war and the suffering that comes with it destroys the experience of childhood, destroys the opportunity for children to be children, to sort of undergo normal development, and the way that cultural activity can give them a sense of respite or time and space in which they can not think about the terrible things that have befallen them and instead sort of enjoy themselves, engage in sort of productive play and so forth. I actually have friends in Ukraine who are doing more or less precisely this kind of work right now. And, I've seen again and again how valuable that kind of thing can be. And so it to me, it sort of drove home that there is an element of universality to this, while the circumstances of the Warsaw Ghetto are, of course, so particular, that there are sort of these underlying themes of, essentially care for the vulnerable members of our society under these traumatic circumstances, that I think we can find those parallels present.
Absolutely. And we, of course, are just beginning to understand it, and it will be a while before we're in the position to think about it as cultural historians. In any case, I just want to thank you again. I want to thank Dr. Julia Riegel for her enlightening presentation. And I think we had a large and very grateful audience today. I want to wish you a very successful remaining months of your fellowship here. And for those who are interested, the last event will be on April 19th. We'll have a talk on Jewish Russian and Jewish Ukrainian science fiction. And thank you for being with us. And thanks again, Dr. Riegel.
Thank you.